I'm sorry, I have to put this back. Her voice was so small she could barely hear it herself. But the sharp beep of the scanner had already sounded far too clearly. The pale yellow can of baby formula, the only thing little Mila could drink without breaking out in rashes or crying in pain for hours, had just been added to the bill. Total, $37.68. She had $34. Nina Carter froze at the checkout counter. One hand gripped her worn-out leather wallet. The other trembled slightly on the handle of the old grocery cart. It was one of those loaner carts from the store, the kind that squeaked every time you turned left. Her face burned hot, and sweat pooled in her palms. Can I take the formula off, please? She turned to the cashier. The young man with spiky brown hair frowned, gave a small nod, and said nothing. No judgment, no sympathy. Just routine. Maybe this happened to more people than she'd ever realized. Nina slid the can of formula toward him, trying her best to keep her voice steady, but the words caught somewhere in her throat instead. A sigh from someone behind her in line made her flinch. She didn't dare turn around. Every stare felt like it was pressing against the back of her neck, and all she wanted in that moment was to disappear. She had planned it carefully, counted the money 3 times before leaving her tiny apartment. Even included the spare change she'd found on the floor yesterday. But what she hadn't planned for was no sale today, no miracle discount. And the coupon she used to keep tucked in her wallet? She'd left it somewhere, gone without a trace. She closed her eyes and pictured Mila sleeping peacefully in the old fabric cradle, her tiny lips still pursed, as if she were still suckling. Every time Mila finished a bottle of that special formula, she would drift off quietly. No fuss, no tears. But if Nina used the cheaper kind, she'd be up all night rubbing her baby's belly, whispering lullabies through cracked lips. Tonight, that seemed inevitable. Nina was only 29, but she looked older. The early shifts at the bakery had darkened the skin under her eyes. Her hands always smelled faintly of yeast and frying oil. She didn't hate the job. She was grateful for it, because it paid the electric bill and part of the rent, but not much more. Mila had been born nearly 2 months premature. For the first 2 weeks, she'd lived inside an incubator. Nina had stood beside it the whole time, not eating, not sleeping, just praying her daughter would keep breathing. Since then, she'd never once allowed herself to let go. Being a single mother in a quiet suburb with no close friends, no family nearby, it was a long, silent battle she fought every single day. I'll return the formula to storage. Would you like to continue with the rest of your purchase? The cashier's voice came again. Nina nodded. Bread, oatmeal, a bag of frozen beans, and 2 jars of baby food, the cheapest items on her list. She grabbed the plastic bag, slipped the receipt into her wallet, and pushed the cart toward the exit in strained silence. She didn't know that, just one person away, a pair of eyes had been watching her the entire time. Not with pity, not with judgment. The man didn't look like anyone else in the store. No suit, no tie, just a knee-length brown coat, clean shoes, and an unhurried walk. He'd been there since the moment she stood in the baby aisle, torn between the cheaper formula and the one the doctor had recommended. He didn't pull out his phone like everyone else, didn't rush like the stream of shoppers pushing their carts past. He just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the can of formula being pushed back. Such a small act, yet something about it held him still. Nina left the store with her head down, her footsteps heavy, as if the weight of the whole world rested on her shoulders. And right then, the man began to walk toward her. When Nina walked through the sliding doors of the supermarket, Owen still hadn't moved. His eyes followed the thin figure pushing an empty cart out the door, as if she'd just left behind something far more important than a can of formula. No one in line said a word, but Owen could feel the quiet ripple of impatience. A middle-aged man shook his head. A young woman glanced at her phone, typing with an indifferent look. And Owen just stood there, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his basket, his mind fixed on what he'd just witnessed. Owen Blanchard, 41 years old, tall, calm, dressed simply but with quiet refinement. In the world of architecture a few years back, his name had been spoken with awe, a rising visionary. He built his own firm, had an office downtown, was once invited to speak at major conferences. But after the sudden death of his wife in a car accident, he stepped away from it all. He left the city, sold the office, bought a small house on the outskirts, a place where no one knew his name, no one mentioned his achievements or his loss. Only his nephew, Noel, could pull Owen out of the silence he wrapped himself in every day. Noel was 6, the son of Owen's younger sister. After school, the boy often came over to spend a few hours with him. This weekend, Owen had promised to take Noel camping near the woods. Just 2 guys, a tent, a bag of roasted potatoes, and a few of the boys' favorite snacks. They were at the supermarket to pick up some supplies. While waiting in line, Noel looked around curiously, tapping his shoe lightly against the cart wheel. Owen stood quietly, but when the words, "I'm sorry, I have to put this back," came from the woman in front of them, he lifted his head. No one reacted much, no shouting, no scene, but it was the silence that struck him. The woman, Nina, didn't raise her voice, didn't cry, didn't beg. She simply bowed her head and slid the can of formula back toward the cashier with slow, reluctant hands. She wasn't expecting help. There was no one to expect it from. There was something different about the way she faced her situation. No complaints, no dramatics. Yet it made anyone watching feel as if they had accidentally stepped into someone's most private moment. It made Owen feel ashamed for just standing there, doing nothing. Noel looked up and tugged on his uncle's sleeve. "Uncle Owen, why does she look so sad?" The question was simple, gentle, but it hit like lightning. Owen didn't answer right away. In his mind, he saw himself 2 years earlier, standing alone in the emergency room when they told him his wife hadn't made it. No one cried then either. There was only a blinding white emptiness, silent, cold, and so still it made him tremble. That feeling of helplessness, he'd lived with it long enough to recognize it instantly, in the woman who had just walked out. "I don't know," Owen said softly, resting a hand on Noel's shoulder. "But I think she's needed someone to ask her that for a very long time." When it was his turn, Owen still hadn't decided what to do, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just walk out of there and pretend he hadn't seen anything. What unsettled him wasn't the fact that she'd returned the item, but how she did it. The way she hid her pain so well that, unless you looked closely, you'd think she was just a few dollars short, not someone whose whole life was bending under the weight of that single can of formula. He quietly placed their essentials into the cart. A loaf of Noel's favorite sandwich bread, a few protein bars, some bottles of juice, a small bag of charcoal. But as they passed the baby aisle, he stopped. His hand reached out and picked up the pale yellow can of formula, the same kind the woman had just returned, and set it gently into his cart. "Are you buying that?" Noel asked, wide-eyed. "Yeah," Owen replied softly, "because some things shouldn't be left behind just because of a few missing dollars." And for the first time in a very long while, Owen felt something stir in his chest. Not pity, and not some noble impulse to do good, but recognition. He had just seen another version of himself. Someone who'd lost, who'd endured in silence, who didn't know how to keep going but did anyway. And he knew then, he didn't want that woman to have to keep walking alone. Not for one more day. Owen finished checking out while Noel was busy playing with a whale-shaped keychain hanging near the counter. The cashier scanned each item briskly. When the can of baby formula came up, his eyes lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to ask something. But then he quietly continued. Owen said nothing, just gave a small nod. He grabbed a small bag of red apples, some banana-flavored baby snacks, a pack of tissues, and 2 jars of baby food from the nearby shelf before heading toward the exit. In his hands now weren't just groceries for his nephew, but also something meant for someone whose name he didn't even know. Outside, the air had turned colder as dusk began to settle. The glow from the parking lot lights cast a dull, hazy shine across the rows of cars. Owen squinted, scanning the lot, searching for a familiar figure. Finally, he saw her, at the far edge of the parking lot, sitting alone on a wooden bench at an old bus stop. No shelter above her. The wind tugged at her thin coat, revealing a pale arm and the fragile line of her neck. Nina was hunched over, both hands gripping a torn paper bag. She kept it close to her feet, as if afraid the wind might carry it away. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. Maybe she was thinking about Mila. Maybe about the few dollars left in her wallet. Maybe both. Owen couldn't tell. He only knew he couldn't just walk away as if he hadn't seen her. He told Noel to stay by the car and not move, then started walking toward Nina. Slow, careful steps. In his hand was a small bag containing the can of formula and a few other things he thought a mother might need. No sound, no rush. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped. "Ma'am," his voice came out low, steady, calm but not distant. Nina startled and looked up. For a moment, her eyes met his. Not fear, but guardedness. She took a small step back, clutching the torn bag tighter, her gaze fixed on the stranger standing in front of her. "I don't mean to intrude," Owen said quickly. "I just thought this belonged to you." He held the bag out in front of him, the familiar can of baby formula clearly visible inside. Nina shook her head almost immediately. "No, thank you," she said softly but firmly. "I can't accept that." "I'm not expecting anything," Owen replied, keeping the bag right where it was. "I just saw that you needed it, and I can afford it. That's all." Nina pressed her lips together. Her eyes flicked from the bag back to him. A part of her wanted to stand up and walk away. She was used to refusing help, used to handling things alone. Accepting something from a stranger meant owing something, opening a space she couldn't control. But what about Mila? Mila couldn't drink the cheap formula. Tonight, without that can, Nina knew exactly what awaited them. Owen didn't say another word. He didn't move the bag closer either. He just stood there, calm, patient, as if this moment didn't need to be rushed at all. A gust of wind swept through. Nina pulled her collar close and shut her eyes for a second. Then, as if she'd just finished a long, silent conversation with herself, she reached out her hand. She didn't look him in the eye when she took the bag. Didn't say thank you. She didn't have to, but her fingers brushed his for the briefest moment. And in that fleeting glance, Owen saw it. Exhaustion, pride, and a quiet gratitude that hadn't found its way into words yet. The hiss of bus brakes cut through the fragile silence between them. Nina immediately stood, clutching the bag to her chest, and hurried toward the open door. She didn't look back, didn't meet his eyes. She just walked away, as if stopping, even for a second, might make her cry. Owen stood there, watching her silhouette fade behind the scratched glass of the silver-white bus. Inside him, nothing felt lighter, nothing heavier, just stillness. And for the first time in a long while, he felt enough. On the ride home from the bus stop, Nina never let go of the new paper bag. Her other arm held Mila close against her chest, feeling her daughter's warm little breath through the thin fabric of her coat. The baby slept soundly, her head resting gently on her mother's shoulder, unaware that once again her mother had chosen to stay standing with the help of a stranger's quiet hand. The apartment was the same. Gray walls, creaky wooden floor, fogged-up window panes. But when Nina set the can of formula down on the kitchen counter, something felt different. Not in the room. In her. For the first time in months, she felt like someone had truly seen her. Not with pity. Not with the shallow concern of polite acquaintances. But with a kind of silent gaze. One without pressure, without explanation, without expecting anything in return. Nina laid Mila in her cradle, tucked the thin blanket over her, then went back to the kitchen table. She brewed a cup of tea from an old, reused tea bag, her hands trembling slightly, from exhaustion and from emotions she couldn't quite name. From a drawer, she pulled out an old notebook. Its leather cover cracked, its pages yellowed at the edges. Her journal. She used to write every day back in high school. About her dream of becoming a nurse, about the first time she met her ex-husband, about their simple backyard wedding at her mother's house. But ever since he disappeared, right after finding out that Mila would need special medical care for at least her first 2 years, she hadn't written a single word. Writing meant facing things. And for so long, all she'd been trying to do was survive. Nina sat down and opened to the first blank page in over a year. Her hand hovered above the paper for a few seconds. Then she began to write. "Tonight, a stranger bought my daughter a can of formula. He didn't ask for my name, didn't hand me a business card. He just left the bag and said he didn't expect anything in return. I don't know why it moved me so much. Maybe because for the first time in so long, someone actually looked at me. Really saw me, not just as a tired, busy, fading mother, but as a person who still exists. Maybe I'm not entirely alone." She stopped writing. Her heartbeat slowed with each line she reread. The feeling wasn't exactly relief. It was something else, something quieter, like washing her face after a long day. It didn't fix everything, but it reminded her that she was still here, still alive. Across town, Owen unlocked his front door with the old key, not bothering to turn on the lights. He knew every creak and step in the wooden house he'd designed himself. The desk lamp in the corner still glowed with a soft amber light, Noel's books scattered across the couch. The familiar scent of wood and candle wax filled the quiet space, muffling the noise of the outside world. He hung up his coat and walked into the kitchen, still holding the empty paper bag after unpacking Noel's things. But what lingered most in his mind wasn't the cookies or the juice boxes. It was the image of the woman at the bus stop, sitting small and folded in on herself, clutching that paper bag as if it were the last shield between her and the rest of the world. Owen rested his hand on the counter, the cool surface grounding him. He closed his eyes for a moment. He'd donated to scholarship funds, retirement homes, distance education programs. He'd written six-figure checks without a second thought. But somehow, tonight felt different. It had been a long time since he'd done something that wasn't through an organization, that didn't have a purpose or a measurable outcome. This wasn't about impact or recognition. It was simply because he saw someone who needed help, and he could help. He turned on the stove to boil water for Noel's milk. When the kettle whistled, it hit him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd helped someone without money being involved. Maybe it had been so long that even his heart had forgotten how. And tonight, that habit had just been broken. A week later, while Nina was wiping down the counter after finishing a chocolate cake, a coworker walked over and handed her a pale white envelope. "Someone left this for you. No name on it." Nina wiped her hands on her apron and took it, turning it over. No logo, no stamp, just her name handwritten neatly across the front in unfamiliar handwriting. She frowned slightly, feeling a strange twinge, like seeing an unfamiliar light flicker outside your window at midnight. Not frightening, exactly, but enough to make you stop and look. She opened the envelope carefully with her fingertip, making sure not to tear it. Inside was a single thin sheet of white paper, folded neatly into thirds. On it, one line written in blue ink. "If you had the chance to study again, what would you choose?" No signature, no return address, no explanation. Nina read the line again and again, then glanced around the bakery, half expecting someone to step out, chuckle, and say, "Just kidding," but no one did. Beneath the note was a printed form, an application for a scholarship program for single mothers pursuing nursing, an 8-month course, with full tuition and living expenses covered by a local charitable foundation. She read each line slowly, her chest tightening with something she couldn't name. The training center was just a short bus ride from her apartment. The class schedule was flexible. The requirements didn't ask for a college degree, only a personal statement about why she wanted to apply. Nina held the paper in her hands for a long time, her thoughts spinning. She didn't mention it to anyone, didn't ask around. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a faint trace of recognition. No one she knew could have sent it. Not anyone from the bakery. Not her neighbors, not friends. She hardly had any left who would do something like this. There was only one person she could think of when it came to things done without expecting anything in return. The man at the bus stop. Even without proof, even if it was all just coincidence, her instinct told her it was from him. The handwriting was concise, unadorned. The kind of quiet gesture that offered an opportunity instead of advice. It felt like something from a person who understood that true help sometimes means nothing more than opening a door, and then stepping back. Nina folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket before returning to work. But her mind was no longer on cakes or orders. The question kept echoing in her head. If you had the chance to study again. That night, she spread the papers across the kitchen table. The warm yellow light cast over her face, tense but focused. Beside her, Mila slept peacefully in the cradle. Nina looked at her daughter and remembered all those nights she'd held her through fevers, coughing fits, and stomach cramps. All the moments that made her wish she knew more, understood more, so she wouldn't feel so helpless like in those first months. She had once wanted to study nursing. That dream existed long before she got married, but then it was set aside. For the wedding, for pregnancy, for the lack of money, for a dozen reasons that piled up until she told herself to forget it. But that question, just 7 words, had stirred back to life a part of her she thought was gone. She picked up a pen and began filling out the application. Her hand trembled, but she didn't hesitate. She didn't know if she'd be accepted. She didn't know if this was hope or a trap disguised as one. But for the first time in years, she refused to let fear make the choice for her. What she didn't know was this. Behind that scholarship program was a foundation named after an architect who chose to remain anonymous. A man who had requested that every donation be handled quietly. No publicity, no ceremonies, no recognition. At the training center, they only referred to him as the anonymous benefactor. He had never met anyone from the program. Yet over the past 3 years, he had donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to support single mothers trying to rebuild their lives. He believed that some of the biggest changes began with letters that carried no name. Nina sat silently before the application form, the pen uncapped but unmoving since the night before. The kitchen light was still on, not because she'd forgotten, but because she wasn't ready to sleep. She looked over at her daughter, breathing softly in her cradle, each gentle rise and fall of Mila's chest tightening the invisible string around Nina's heart. She knew that if she applied and was accepted, it would mean leaving her job at the bakery. The program required at least 4 daytime classes a week. No night shifts, no flexible schedule, no paycheck, no steady income. But the problem wasn't just money. It was Mila. Who would watch her while Nina studied? Daycare? Too expensive. A babysitter? Impossible. Neighbors? None close enough to trust with her child. She turned the pen slowly between her fingers. Her left hand brushed against the small scar on her chest, faded with time but still there, a quiet reminder. When she was 12, she had once struggled to breathe during gym class. The diagnosis? A mild heart defect. Not life-threatening, but it required early treatment. The first nurse who greeted her in the emergency room was an older woman with silver hair and calm eyes. She took Nina's trembling hand and said, "You're going to be okay. I'm right here." Those words, that presence, had stayed with Nina for years. They were what had sparked her dream of becoming a nurse. Not for the uniform, not for the paycheck, but to be the first face someone saw when they were terrified, the calm in the middle of panic. That dream had lived inside her until she was 21, until 2 red lines appeared on a pregnancy test, and the man she loved said, "We'll figure it out together." She dropped out of school, married quickly, and a few months after Mila was born, that same man left, with a short note that said, "I can't do this." Now, the chance to study again stood before her like a door left slightly open. But stepping through it wasn't easy. That afternoon, while taking out the trash, she ran into Mrs. Marla, her downstairs neighbor, an older woman with snow-white hair who lived alone, always sitting on the porch with a newspaper and a cup of tea. Marla often complained about kids being too loud, but she'd never once been unkind to Mila. "You look tired," the woman said, noticing Nina leaning against the railing, eyes sunken from lack of sleep. Nina meant to give a polite, automatic reply, but somehow the truth spilled out instead. She told Marla about the scholarship, the anonymous letter, the fear of quitting her job, and most of all, about having no one to watch Mila. Mrs. Marla didn't say a word the whole time Nina spoke. She just nodded occasionally, listening quietly. Then, after a long pause, she took a sip of her tea and said matter-of-factly, "I used to be a nurse for 27 years. Now I just sit around doing nothing. If you let me watch Mila in the mornings, I'd at least feel useful instead of counting how many leaves fall off my porch." Nina stared at her, speechless. Marla pursed her lips. "But I'm not changing diapers. That's still your job." Nina laughed, for the first time that day, and for the first time she felt help that didn't come from pity, but from quiet understanding. That night, she sat back down at the table and picked up her pen again. This time, there was no hesitation. Before sealing the application, she took a small piece of paper and wrote by hand, "I choose to believe I deserve this." She folded the note, slipped it into an envelope. No address, no recipient's name. The scholarship application had been submitted online, but this letter she chose to send the old-fashioned way to the address printed on the form. It didn't matter whether anyone read it or not. Sometimes simply saying the words, even if only to yourself, is enough to begin a new life. On Thursday afternoon, just after finishing her class on inpatient care skills, Nina noticed a small blue backpack lying in the middle of the hallway in Wing C. That section was reserved for the children's classes, a supervised area for kids whose parents attended short-term training programs. She bent down to pick it up. It was light. She unzipped it to check inside and found a child's knitted sweater, a coloring book, and a plastic name tag clipped to a red ribbon. She turned the name tag over in her hand. The printed letters read, "Noelle Blanchard." Below it was an emergency contact number. But it wasn't the number that made her freeze. It was the last name. Uncommon, unmistakable. Her heart gave a small, sharp tremor. She had never known the name of the man at the bus stop, but now she didn't need confirmation. She walked toward the support office to return the backpack, but just as she reached the doorway, she saw a tall figure standing with his back to her, speaking to the staff. She stopped in her tracks, still holding the backpack in her hand. The man turned at the sound of her slow footsteps. Their eyes met. Owen looked at her for a long second. Then he smiled, softly, without surprise, without awkwardness. "Hello," he said first. Nina swallowed hard and held out the backpack. "I think this belongs to your boy." "Thank you," Owen said, taking the backpack, his eyes still on her. "Noel has a habit of dropping his things everywhere. Sometimes I think he does it on purpose, just so he has an excuse to come back." They both laughed quietly. The air in the hallway seemed to soften. Nina tightened her grip on the strap of her canvas bag. "I didn't expect to see you here." "And I didn't expect to see you here either," Owen replied. "But I'm glad I did." Neither of them mentioned the can of formula. Neither spoke about the letter or the scholarship. Yet somehow, the things left unspoken filled the space between them more clearly than words ever could. "How's the studying going?" Owen asked, as if it were the only question that truly mattered. "Taking it one day at a time," Nina said, lifting her head, her voice steady now. "Just enough pressure to keep me from giving up, and just enough faith to not feel foolish for starting over." Owen nodded slowly. "Sounds like a good place to stay." They stood there, neither in a hurry. Around them came the sounds of students' footsteps, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards from the admin office, children's laughter spilling from a nearby classroom. And yet, in the middle of it all, there was a quiet space, still and unspoken, that seemed to belong only to the two of them. Nina looked at Owen, this time more closely. He hadn't changed much, still calm, still carrying that steady quietness in his eyes, the kind that made you feel safe without knowing why. And she realized she'd felt this before, that same sense of calm, on that evening at the bus stop, when he had simply stood there and offered her a choice, without pressure, without expectation. "You brought your son to class?" she asked. "Yeah," Owen nodded. "Noel loves the science program here, once a week." He paused for a moment. "And you? Do you have someone to watch Mila?" "My neighbor," Nina said with a soft smile. "Used to be a nurse, now she's become my unpaid guardian angel." Owen chuckled. Then he glanced at his watch. "I should go pick up Noel," he said, a gentle way to close the conversation. "Of course," Nina nodded, taking a small step back. "Thank you for the backpack." Owen shook his head lightly. "Thank you for finding it." No more words, no promises to meet again, no phone numbers exchanged, no social media handles shared. Just two people who had once, by chance, touched the cracks in each other, and quietly kept walking in directions neither could predict. But this time, both walked away with the quiet sense that maybe fate wasn't entirely random after all. When Nina turned and walked away down that hallway, she didn't know if she would ever see Owen again. They hadn't exchanged numbers, hadn't promised to keep in touch, just a brief glance and a smile gentle enough to linger in memory. But some encounters, even fleeting ones, are enough to push a person towards something better. And she chose to keep moving forward, as someone who had decided she would no longer stand still. Winter passed, the program ended, and the graduation ceremony took place beneath warm yellow lights and the applause of women like her, single mothers who had fought quietly but fiercely. Nina no longer wished to see the man from that evening. Yet what he had left behind, not a promise but a kind of faith, stayed with her through every step of that journey. The clinic glowed in the soft light of early summer, golden streaks slanting across the walls like brushstrokes painting hope onto white. Nina adjusted her white blouse in the mirror, straightened her name tag, Nina Carter, nurse. A year ago, she never would have believed she'd see this day. Her apartment was still small. One bedroom, a living room that doubled as a kitchen, and a balcony just big enough to hang clothes. But things were different now. Rent paid on time, Mila with milk, diapers, and new shoes. She still wasn't rich, but she no longer felt the tight, painful strain of scarcity. Every morning, when Mila grinned wide and wrapped her little arms around her neck before Mrs. Marla carried her off to play, Nina reminded herself. All of this began with someone who handed her an opportunity, and then quietly walked away. The community health clinic was held at a neighborhood center where mothers brought their children for free checkups. Nina had volunteered to help. Her workplace partnered with the program, and she loved days like this. Lively, noisy, and full of stories. She was in the middle of measuring a 3-year-old boy's height when a woman's voice called out, "Next, Noel Blanchard." Nina straightened up. Her heart gave a small, tight pull. That last name, it had been a year, but she would never mistake it. Noel walked in first, taller now, hair a little longer, and right behind him was Owen. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark jeans, and the same steady, luminous gaze, calm, grounded, and warm. When he saw Nina, he paused for a second, then smiled slowly. No surprise, no hesitation, as if deep down both had been quietly hoping for this moment to come. "My son seems to be having a little trouble with the eye chart," Owen said lightly, nodding toward Noelle. "And I heard there's a very good clinic working with today's program." Nina didn't answer right away. She smiled, unable and unwilling to hide the emotion in her eyes. "I think he came to the right place." She guided Noelle toward the vision test, chatting with him as she worked, occasionally glancing back at Owen. There was no awkward distance now, no object between them serving as an excuse to talk. Just two people meeting again, this time standing on equal ground. When the checkup was over, Owen stood, picked up his jacket, then turned to Nina. "Last time, I gave you a can of formula," he said, his voice laced with a hint of humor. "This time, if I ask you out for coffee, I promise I won't bring anything with me." Nina burst out laughing, not shy, not evasive, and for the first time in years, her laughter wasn't shadowed by fear. Not fear of being left, not fear of being judged, not fear of not being enough. Just a woman, living her own life. "Coffee sounds good," she replied, "as long as it's nowhere near the dairy aisle." Owen laughed too, a quiet, genuine sound, as if he'd just stepped out of a long silence himself. They didn't need to say anything more, just a brief meeting of eyes and a plan to see each other after the clinic. Both of them knew, this time, whatever began, it wouldn't be out of pity, but out of respect. As Nina bent down to tidy up, Mila, now toddling in the corner, grabbed onto a chair and took her very first steps. Small, wobbly, uncertain, yet steady. Sunlight poured through the glass window, falling across the floor like it was drawing a path made just for her. Nina looked up and saw Owen watching from a distance. He didn't say a word, just gave a quiet nod, and she knew he understood. Sometimes, it takes just one person brave enough to step forward, in a moment no one else notices, to change an entire life. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last moment. Sometimes, a small act of kindness, reaching out at just the right time, doesn't just change someone's day, but opens a whole new direction for their life. You don't have to do something grand, just something true and timely. Do you believe that a stranger could become a turning point in your journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd truly love to hear from you. If this story touched something in your heart, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next ones. Stories about kindness, choices, and the small things that spark great change. Thank you for listening. See you again in the next story.